And they've also missed out application accounts because they're usually the ones that most organizations forget about because they're the biggest fear factor about controlling. How do we control the way that our web app or our business critical application connects to a database, connects to a server to do whatever? Developers often don't have the right tool sets available, so what we end up doing is maybe hard coding the username and password in the script. So you see something like username equals, password equals. It's surprising how common that is. And obviously with a hard-coded credential like that, anyone who's got access to the script now has access to those privileged credentials. So when we go back to talking about how attackers are trying to move around the infrastructure, that's the kind of thing they're looking for nice, easy targets. And I think obviously some of the fairly high-profile breaches that have happened have talked about the fact that there's been embedded credentials and credentials stored in documents and scripts, et cetera, which have allowed the attackers to move around. Okay. So that's kind of talking about what privilege is. In terms of how the attackers are using these privileged accounts, what they're actually doing, well, this is a high-level snapshot, really, of what's kind of going on. Now, it doesn't really matter who the attacker is. It doesn't matter if they're an outsider, a hacktivist, or a state-sponsored organization, or if they're an insider, a malicious insider user, or a third party, because although they use various techniques to gain access to the, through the perimeter into the organization, they all have to do the same thing at one point or another, and that is they have to escalate their privileges because they have to get access to these sensitive assets they're after to steal the data or to bring down a service. So they all converge through the same point as part of their attack process. Once they've got that access, they're then looking to escalate their privileges. And once they've got a set of credentials, they then actually end up in a cycle. It might be that they start moving around looking for other credentials and moving around the infrastructure till they finally reach their goal point, which might be data exfiltration, or it might be bringing down a service, or whatever it may be. And what I want to focus on as part of an example is that cycle, the privilege escalation cycle, and what's actually happening, and really how simple it is for an attacker to go through this process. Right. So just to simplify that cycle, the first stage is the attackers breach the perimeter. Okay. They obviously have to do that after an external entity. If they're an insider, well, there's no breach needed. They're inside. From that access point, they then look for credentials. And once they've found the credentials, they start to extract them. And I'll talk about what simple extraction techniques there are for getting access to passwords. In the panel session, already the hashes were talked about, and that's one of the things I'll mention. And they retrieve those credentials, and then they look to use them and gain access to another asset. Okay. Now, this isn't necessarily the end of the story. It may be that actually what they've gained access to is another server with access to another set of credentials, and we end up going around in a cycle as the attacker moves around looking for what they're essentially after and complete their objective, complete their goal. Okay. So I want to go through an example of where that cycle went through about 4 or 5 times. It was an attack the head of our cybersecurity team talked me through. The good thing about him is he speaks Russian, so he was able to translate this particular one. It was a breach that was basically advertised. It was bragged about by the hacktivists who carried it out. It was part of, it was an attack during the Ukrainian elections, focused on a governor from a specific region in the Ukraine. I'm not even going to try and pronounce it, but you can see it on the screen. And I want to just kind of explain what they did and how simple really it was for them. So they started scoping out this particular governor's office, and they actually found a website which had a bug in the web server. And also, fortunately for them, that web server was also internally connected to their internal network. So that was their breach point. Exploiting that bug, exploiting that issue with the web server, they were onto the web server itself. And that's where they were. They couldn't really move any further than that. But then they started looking for credentials that are on that server that would allow them to move around to another point in the infrastructure. So one of the mechanisms they could use is a technique, assuming this was a Windows server, a technique called pass the hash. As a show of hands, how many people are familiar with the pass the hash technique? Okay, so around about 30–40% of the room. To summarize it very high level, essentially whenever you log into a Windows operating system, whether it be desktop or server-based, it maintains a hash of the credential that you entered. Okay. Now, if I then log into 9 or 10 or 12 other servers with the same credential, that hash is the same in all the boxes. Attackers can actually extract the hashes from an operating system and use it to move around to different servers. It's a very straightforward technique. It's something that one of our engineers in the company has demonstrated at one of the events and did it within about 20 seconds, which is to extract the hashes on a server and then use that to remotely connect to other systems where those credentials have been used. Okay? These are freeware utilities that you can find on the internet if you go home and Google pass-the-hash, extraction tools. Suggest you do it at home, maybe not at work, because it should hopefully flag some alerts.